morning, everybody. Welcome to Life Beyond Sunday.
What if it's not morning when they're watching?
I said good morning, and then I was like, Shayla's going to yell at me for saying good morning.
That's what we do.
Because some people don't listen in the morning. They listen in the afternoon.
What? Shayla was bullying you.
She was bullying me. We were just talking about that too.
Welcome back to Life Beyond Sunday.
That was not my best introduction. I'm working on it. I'm saying hello from a place of fear now.
Oh my gosh.
Let's dissect that.
No, this is not time for therapy. Okay. So anyways, this time this season we're talking a lot about leadership.
Yeah.
And we talked about levels of leadership last week, which was really good. And we talked a lot. We ended up bringing a lot of culture into that. And so today we're going to talk about how you lead through or identify that a culture shift needs to take place. And how that happens.
Yeah.
And so if you're like somebody I'm not in the workplace, but hey, I'm a stay-at-home mom.
Sure.
Or man, sometimes that looks like a change in your family, right? There's a dynamic that is no longer working.
Yeah.
And like you are like something has to flip, right? And so today we're going to talk about some practical ways to make that happen and how to identify that needs to happen, either in an organization or at home or, in a church setting or whatever. So I guess the first question is, how do you practically evaluate culture somewhere? So how do I look at my family? How do I look at my organization? How do I look at the team that I lead in church? And I evaluate if that's a healthy culture or a not healthy culture.
All right, this kind of a tough one, but there's probably a lot of aspects to it. But I think
it first has to start with values.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. Like, if you don't have a core set of values that you're living by and that are like shape your organization, then like everybody's just kind of doing their own thing, like everybody has their own personal values. So everybody's just kind of scattered maybe and not working towards the same thing. Like we have a shared set of values. So we have church values, but then we also have staff values that drive our staff culture. And Craig Rochelle said it best one time. He said, it doesn't matter what's written on your walls if it's not happening in your halls. So if like you're not seeing those values played out in your organization, then do you really value them? Yeah.
And I think you have to start there.
Yeah.
And you have to look at it and you have to go. I remember we did this not too long ago. We actually went through every staff member and we rated them.
Like, here's our values. How are they modeling those?
How are they modeling those? And where are people falling short? And if they're falling short, let's have conversations with them about that. And let's raise that standard to where we set, this is the bar of who we are and how we act and how we relate with one another, because we are the culture setters for our church.
Yeah. I think you can do that in your family too. Like your family can have a set of values. Like this is what our family values. And you guys are having conversations centered around that. And you're talking about that. And, it's a shared piece of where you're going.
Yeah.
And what you want to model.
I remember when Alexander was born, I said, hey, there's only a couple of rules.
Oh, jeez.
In the McCormick household.
Oh gosh, I don't know if we're ready for this.
And these are the values. I mean, he's a baby. He's like, we love each other. We win.
Oh my gosh.
And we love God.
Yeah.
Like those are non-negotiable. These are family values of our home. Yeah. Like this is what we do. We love God, we love each other, and we win.
Yeah.
Outside of that, we'll work on those other things, but this is what we're basing things off of. And I think you have to decide, you don't always get to decide if you're just an employee, but you have to know what that value system is and go, are we living by these things? And
am I aligned with this?
And am I good with these values?
Yeah.
Because if you're not, then it's never going to be a healthy place for you.
Yeah, that's good. If you're listening and you don't know your values, or you don't know the company's values, or they can't be seen, or your family, if you ask your kids what are our values and they don't know, pause, Go write that down and come back, right? They should know those things. You know, Alana the other day was in the car and she was doing we were talking about something and she was afraid. And she's like, you know what though? Kamaras do hard things. Yes. Those are one of our family values. Yep. So she can spit that out in a second and know, okay, this is something. Yep. So that's important either in an organization or in a.
Well, and I think you have to reevaluate those things too over time. Like I know we've gone back through our staff values and gone like, is this really playing out in our organization? Because if it's not, then it's not really something that we value.
Right. It's an aspiration, but it's not a value.
Right.
Right. Is there something else that you would say like, hey, is there, besides the values that like,
I mean, I think sometimes if there's a high turnover rate and things like that there's probably cultural issues.
Would you put productivity in here?
Mm-hmm. Like
if an organization isn't productive, then probably like, would you?
Mm-hmm. Okay. What would you say?
Productivity.
That's what I figured.
So values, high turnover, productivity, those are probably a sign. So if you're not being productive and you're not producing results, then that's probably a sign that things need to change. Mm-hmm. If people in your organization can't set off their values or those values don't seem like they're aligning, that's a sign. Mm-hmm. And if you have people in and out your door consistently, that's a sign of things, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. As a leader, how do you implement change? So a lot of times this happens in churches and organizations. You guys started this church with just the two of you, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe like 30 people you didn't know, and you started to hire staff. Yeah. And maybe, why were you laughing? It wasn't even 30.
No, it was barely. Yeah, I think it was 35. 30.
Yeah.
35.
So those people start, and when you're young, when you're a young church, you do things. When you're in a young organization, you set things off, and then 10 years down the line, now maybe things that served you before don't serve you anymore. Yeah. And you need to create change. Mm-hmm. Now, there have been people who have been with you for 10 years. Right. Yeah. Right. How do you implement that in an organization when you're like, okay, this used to work 10 years ago. It doesn't work now. This used to work 20 years ago. It doesn't work now. Mm-hmm. And I honor the fact that you've been with me and I want to keep you with me, but now I need to change your course, your direction. How do you do that? Mm-hmm.
I think part of that goes back to, your values. Like we're always part of is one of our church values is healthy people grow. Well, if that's a value of our church, then as an organization, we're growing. And here's what happens when you grow. You change. Yeah. Healthy things that grow are going to be changing, which means we're always going to be changing. And if we're not changing, we're probably not growing. So, I think they say organizationally, if you're growing, every 2 years, your organizational chart is probably going to change. Yeah. Like you're going to be restructuring. Why? Because if you're growing, you're going to outgrow whatever that system is that was currently working. It's going to begin to break because of growth, which means you're going to have to change. So change isn't a bad thing. And so one of the things we talk about is like change isn't bad. Staying the same is bad. So we've got to be changing and growing and adapting and evolving and becoming. And so that might mean you're gonna move in the organization. You might move up, you might move down, you might move sideways. Those aren't bad things. That's just part of a growing church.
I think if we go back to, we talked in some of the last episodes about, when Charlotte Campbell came in and gave a talk and she talked about mission over position. You have to have that shared mission. Like everybody's going towards this one mission and we're all working towards that. And it's not just about my position or what I do. Like I'm going to do what's best for the organization. But she gave this illustration of a car and like tires on a car. And she was saying, what's healthy for that car, like eventually those tires are going to wear out. And if you don't rotate your tires, they don't last as long. And so all of us in an organization have to be willing to be rotated in order for the longevity of that product, right? And so just always kind of living with that open hand. But I also think that culture a lot of times is more caught than it is taught. And I think if you're not modeling that as a leader, like other people are replicating what you're doing. So if you're changing, if you're evolving, if you're growing, if you're having a good attitude, then the other people are seeing that. You're not asking them to do something that you're unwilling to do.
So is that how you rally people? Because when you do a restructuring or you change things up in an organization,
Oh, it freaks people out.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so unsettling.
It's uncomfortable.
Yes.
So how do you manage that? Like, how do you manage? Because that's a tension, right? Or I don't know if maybe it's I don't even know.
It's a tension to be managed.
Yes.
You're not going to be able to solve that problem because the reality is it's always going to be unsettling. But we've said something for years. We're going to be comfortable being uncomfortable. So it's going to be uncomfortable for a season because it's different, but we've chosen to be growing people, which means we're going to be in uncomfortable situations all the time. And Scripture talks so much about change and pruning, and like in order for things to grow, they have to be pruned, they have to be cut back, they have to be changed and adapted. And so like this is not only good for the organization, it's also a biblical concept that we've got to be changing and evolving. And so it's unsettling, but it's also we as leaders have to be reassuring to people that this is good for them and that this is going to actually be helpful for them. And typically, it's always hard for people because they're like, oh, it goes back to when they get their eyes on themselves instead of the mission. Then it gets unsettling.
I think you also have to be very clear. I think clear is kind, right? I think
Shayla's
a lot of
favorite
times
thing to say.
We can be very ambiguous about what those things look like, and that's what's unsettling for people. But if you can cast a clear vision, a clear mission, a clear like outline of this is where it's going, this is the expectation, this is what we're going to do, this is how it looks, it makes those things a little bit, I think, more palatable maybe for people because there's clarity. People want when it's cloudy and murky, like that's where I think people get lost and they start getting anxious about things and then they just start making their own assumptions, and then you have somebody way over here when if we just would have been clear from the beginning about where we're going, what this looks like, what the mission is, you know.
And how do you continue to speak purpose into somebody who is like, or how do you rally somebody who's like, hey, I know you wanted to be here, like positionally, but we see you here positionally. And what do you just keep reminding them of the value of what here is? Is that how you make sure that they stay committed? Or do you just continue to go back and cast a vision of like the long term? How do you do that?
I think a lot of that is based on giftedness. The reality is people have moved up and down in our organization. And a lot of times when they've moved up and that isn't their giftedness, they actually don't really love that job. And they're actually miserable. And so because I care about them more, like I know that a lot of times, and this is part of being a leader, is being honest with them about like, hey, that isn't your gift. I had this conversation maybe 3 months ago with a guy that came in and said, hey, why am I not being considered for that job? And I just said to him, I said, because that's not your giftedness. Like this job entails a whole bunch of details and management of people, and you hate that stuff. And as I was just being honest with him, he's like, you're right. I was like, I know. That's why I wasn't considering you, because you would end up quitting. The position you're in right now is great you're in the sweet spot of life.
But I think there's also something beautiful about that when you create a culture where people feel comfortable to even ask those questions so that you can bring clarity, you know?
Yeah. That's
is
true.
a big deal.
Yeah.
And I think the reason he felt that is because he knows that I have his best interests in mind.
Well, and again, when you go back to, and this is we're talking church here and ministry here, and I think in any kind of secular organization too, you can have a clear mission, and that's what it always has to come back to, is accomplishing that mission rather than the position we hold.
Yeah,
but
it's also one of the things that I think secular organizations struggle with is identifying wins that people can see themselves accomplishing in their job. So if the win is just the organization making money,
right?
Like the person that is at customer service, how do they see
like
them?
Another cog in the wheel.
They're just a cog in the wheel. And so like you have to, I think every organization has to have a mission that's bigger than just dollars and cents. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, then it's always going to have it's always going to be a shallow organization. You're going to have high turnover and probably poor culture. Yeah. Because it's not, unless the win is that we're going to share in the profits. Mm-hmm. And most organizations are not willing to do that. So you got to have something bigger than that. You got to help every person be able to identify like how they're helping that organization win so that they feel like they're winning in that job. And so that way you can highlight as things are changing in the position they're in, how they are helping the mission of that organization succeed. So they have purpose there.
And we actually, I think you have to celebrate the wins. We actually are horrible at this.
We're really
trying to get better.
We're really good at celebrating people's life change.
Yes.
We're not great at celebrating when
the big
the organization wins.
But I think that matters too, is celebrating people, celebrating, what you accomplish as an organization. And it's definitely a void that we're trying to improve.
Yeah. And it's our struggle because I'm like, as soon as we hit something, I'm like, next.
Yeah, I'm like that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, so
but
it's
other
like,
people
are like, we worked so hard. And I was like, what's next? And that's the bad part for me.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'm actually in sales, and so we'll hit a budget sometimes like a day before the month ends, and I'm like, all right, that was great. Then you literally you go to bed. Now let's figure out June.
But even you think about as a family, when your kids model something really, really well that you guys value as a family, like even celebrating those things. What do they say? What gets rewarded gets repeated. And so it's like taking time to celebrate those things actually creates a behavior that is
and creates culture.
Good. Yeah, it creates
it's
culture.
Funny because something happened at work recently, and we were doing something wrong organizationally here because we went to somebody and we asked like, just in conversation it came up, and the person replied. I said, I don't even actually know what that person does in our organization, and I was like, if you don't know what they do, then you don't know their value, right? Mm-hmm. And so I went around and asked like, do you know what B does? Not really. Do you know what C does? Like what their day? Not really. And I was like, you know what? We have a problem. Yeah. Because if we don't know, and it's not about micromanaging. I don't think we need to know but if we don't understand the value of what that person brings to the table, how do we celebrate that person, right? Yeah. So we, as an organization, we're good at celebrating, okay, oh man, we did this well as an organization, but I'm talking about we, not Coastal, my job. We're not good at like individually calling out like, wow, you brought so much value to this. And that's something now that we've been able to identify just recently that we're like, okay, now how do we fix it? Right? Because if you don't know what each person is bringing to the table, how do you celebrate them?
Yep.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So, all right. Good. So next question. How do you discipline or course correct somebody that you feel like, okay, so I work in an organization, I don't know, let's say there's 20 people there, 40 people there, whatever. 35 are like, we're chugging along, we're bought in, we see the vision, we see the mission. How do you deal with the 5? Or how do you deal with the 1? How do you deal with the bad apple? Fire them.
No. For us, it goes back to those values. Like, how are they not embracing those values? And then we ask them to make adjustments based on that. Like, these are organizational values that we uphold. If you're not going to uphold them, then maybe you can't be a part of the organization.
But I also think those aren't, like, when you're noticing that in your organization, that can't be the only conversation you've had with that person. Yeah. Like, I think there has to be, touch points along the way where you're meeting with those people, you're being a good leader to them, you're help developing them. And if there's still gaps, then there's even relational equity there and room for you to have some of those conversations about values and, that kind of stuff. But if it's only you're going to them to have a conversation about the difficult things, like, you're not creating a healthy culture either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There needs to be another type of,
And the problem is in most organizations, they shy away from the difficult conversations. Instead of when somebody, I've just found that like when you allow something to happen long enough, like that becomes the culture. So like when it first starts to happen, you have to address those things right away. So like when somebody has an attitude that's not right, you're like, hey, that's not how we act. That's not what we say. That's not what we do. Like you have to nip those things in the butt like right away. Otherwise they begin to permeate through.
Yeah.
Yep. And a lot of times they're not even intending, to do those things. It's like in marriage, right? When there's things happening that the other person is doing that's so frustrating or goes against,
Why are you pointing at me like that?
She's like, sometimes people are so frustrating.
Yeah, it's not even like a singular, it's like every finger.
You are my husband, so I should be pointing at you. But you have to have those conversations. If you just stay silent about it, then it's just going to continue to create this resentment and this bitterness, and it's going to make the relationship worse, rather than if at the beginning when you saw something kind of going awry, if you weren't willing to have that conversation, then it could have fixed everything.
What's the difference between a tension to be managed and a problem to be solved, and how do we tell the difference?
That's a stumper.
Ooh, I caught you, didn't
I think in the tension to be managed, it's something beyond your control.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can't control that, so I have to manage that tension. But a problem to be solved, problems are something that are actually solvable. It's an attitude somebody has. It's a habit that someone has. It's a response. It's a productivity level. Those are problems that can be solved. When there are things that are outside of your control and your ability to solve, like that, you just have to manage that tension. Like I manage the tension of people showing up on Sundays. Like, if I could solve that problem, I would have every single family here every Sunday. But I can't. I haven't been able to solve that problem. Like
you're trying to get Parkland to stop doing sports on Sunday.
I was trying to get Parkland to stop doing sports on Sunday, because if we're about the family, then we should actually be creating margin in people's families rather than just filling up their schedule, was my pitch.
Yeah.
And we just continue to fill up their schedules when we wonder why families are getting divorces and parents are not as engaged, because they're so full of stuff. And I just realized that, man, maybe that's a tension that has to be managed. That might not be a problem that I can solve. I tried, but that's beyond my ability to solve it.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I can give an example, like for instance, in kids ministry, we would want to say, listen, we only get your kids for an hour a week. Like we're here to supplement what you do throughout the week. And the reality is parents are going, no, you're the one that's going to teach my kids about these faith values. And, so there's like this tension in that. No, I want you to do it. No, I want you to do it. And so if you're putting that responsibility on us, then we're just going to have to do it and give you every resource that we can. So we're going to manage that tension. I'm not going to solve the problem of maybe that parent not doing those things at home, but, I'm going to manage the tension of the frustration or.
Okay. And to kind of finalize.
Yeah.
What are 2 or 3 things where people are like, okay, either in your home or in your workplace or in a church, you realize that there needs to be a culture shift, a change, a reorganization, whatever that is. What are 2 to 3 things that we can do to sell or spread the vision well when we're trying to like create change?
Model it.
Model it. Like you have to be the change you want to see.
Yep.
Like if you're not willing to embody it and live it, then nobody else is. So you have to go first. Secondly, I think you got to talk about it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You have to communicate.
You have to communicate it. So
Vision
Andy Stanley
leaks.
says vision leaks. So when you think like I'm tired of saying this, is it probably about the time that they're just starting to hear it. Now that is not.
You've all had the conversations where it's
naggy.
like, I said this 1,000,000 times, and now you're just getting it. Yes.
But you think about marketing. They say that a person has to see something 7 times before they recognize it. Mm-hmm. So if we have to see something 7 times before we even recognize it, how many times do you think you have to hear it? And most people are way more visual learners than they are auditory. Mm-hmm. So you have to say it till you're blue in the face. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I tell our worship team all the time, hey, when you're tired of singing that song, our church is just now starting to learn it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know you're tired of singing it, but they're just starting to get it because they've only been one time every 6 weeks. So I know you've sang it 30 times. They've heard it 3 times.
So you have to keep communicating it, whether it's your organization, your family, your marriage.
Well, if you're here for all services, you learn that song real quick.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. I appreciate y'all. And we will see you guys next week.